So those joint and collective conversations, I think, are really quite important. In terms of physical education, what I want to do today is to really share with you insights from young disabled people. And they're really important because they give us the texture and the understanding, just like we see from the previous session that's just taken place as well. So probably for the last 20 years-ish, most of the work that I've been doing is research, and it's been underpinned by trying to find out what young disabled people think, primarily around physical education, school sport and community sport. And I think one of the challenges when you're a researcher, particularly when you're beginning to do research, is you realise that actually you're probably not being trained sufficiently to be able to think about research methods and approaches that may be inclusive for the quite diverse populations that you might be researching with. So one of the challenges within academia, and I'm sure many of you would agree with me, and also within research more broadly, is to be much more open-minded around the kinds of data collection, and as we heard from Brett earlier today, the kinds of engagement that we have with the participants that we're researching with. So very much the ethos of the work that I've undertaken, and the same with Anthony as well, has been to sort of rethink and to question how at university I was taught about research methods. So thinking more laterally about using drawings, using drama, using other kinds of visual and non-visual forms that mean that lots of different kinds of young people can have a meaningful experience from engaging in research, and that's been key really to the work that we've both undertaken. So because we're talking about physical education today, the first thing I'd like to invite you all to do is to get one of the orange post-its and to think about your physical education experience, and specifically, and this is, I just want you to think very quickly, so it's the first thing that comes into your mind. I want you to just think about your PE experience as something that comes to your mind about that PE experience, and just write it down on one of those orange post-its. Can I ask each table now just to think of one point to raise to share with the rest of the group? So again, have a little conversation now about the point that you think you'd quite like to share with everybody else about the physical education experience of the small group that you're with. So this group over here, what is it you want to share about PE experiences?
Well, we were saying that myself and John have always been quite sporty people, but it wasn't necessarily sport that was embedded into the curriculum. So actually, I hated PE, and John, I don't know if you want to share your experience with your impairment.
Well, for me, I was visually impaired. In mainstream school, PE was very difficult because you're doing all the team activities like football, basketball, tennis, all that. But for me, it's impossible to get a see very well.
Okay, so hated and not particularly enjoyed, so that's the reflection there. So thanks for sharing that with us. We'll go over to this table here.
We were talking about my story where I was like excluded and not paid for at all in school. Like I was just put in the library and like, okay, that's what you can do. Yet like now, sport is the reason like why I do everything in. But at school I just wasn't allowed to take part.
Okay, so for you, PE equaled being in the library. Okay, go over to this table here.
Even if you were getting driven by an individual sport or a practitioner, like maybe whether their background. I give examples. A lot of basketball in my school, because my teacher at the time was a practitioner of coaching basketball, so very much driven by the teachers, practitioners, own experiences, and that.
Okay, so the teachers influencing either the nature of the activities.
And that also like what did like a gender stereotyping of the sports we were playing, because we went into that discussion where we were mostly playing like male sports,
Okay.
basketball, football, while the women were more playing netball. And so it was really cool.
Okay. Okay. So the teachers are key brokers of the kinds of activities that we may have all differently experienced within physical education. What about this table here?
Well, I guess fun came up quite a lot, either lots of or lack thereof, because of people loving challenges.
Okay.
Yeah, fun and enjoyment / the opposite.
So a continuum of fun depending on who you were talking to. Thank you.
Also, the role of the teacher is very important. Most of us had a lot of fun, but also very basic football, basketball. And one thing is some of us had school teachers and not specialized sport teachers.
Okay, good. So I'm sensing from this room that we've had different experiences of physical education. Generally, if I ask my students to reflect on physical education, some of them might talk about fun and enjoyment. They might talk about individuals that have influenced them. But quite often, people that gravitate into sport as a profession, whether that's a physical education teacher or a sports coach, have had some experiences that have been relatively positive. However, that's not to say that if you don't have a positive experience, like some of you have demonstrated here, that it doesn't mean that you won't engage in later life, but for many people actually the consequence is that you don't necessarily engage in later life. I suppose the 2 points that I want to make here are around the way in which physical education can define and really influence what young people go on to do in later life. And actually, physical education practitioners are one of the key influences of that. And that's really critical, actually, because they kind of are really influencing then the outlook that young person has. The other point that I want to make is it's quite often a particular model of physical education that we've all experienced. Whether that's gendered is really important, but equally it's quite often competitive kind of sport, and here I'm thinking more within the secondary sector of physical education actually. And quite often PE practitioners want to replicate that kind of experience that they've had because they've enjoyed PE themselves as young people, and they want to pass that on to their students. And this is a systems failure because that passing on may not necessarily be the kind of physical education that might work for lots of different kinds of young people. But actually those practitioners don't necessarily have the empathy or understanding to realise that actually the passing on of the physical education that they want to do may not work for all young people. So that empathy may be lacking there. And I think it is really important that the kind of moving forward with physical education and replication perpetuates the very competitive sports-based sorts of model that does dominate. And here I'm talking about particularly more kind of a UK context, really. So I think that's really important that we understand that. Now we've all reflected on our physical education experiences, what I want to do next is to share with you a number of messages, so a number of key messages that have come out of research that we've undertaken, which is about physical education and what young disabled people think about this. So the first message is that idea that actually physical education can be pivotal in influencing engagement in community sport. So the responsibility that physical education teachers have is quite significant, really. Both teachers and pupils are key to fostering a sense of belonging as well. And again, it's really important that we understand how young disabled people feel about their physical education experience, and if they feel like it's a place or a space that they do belong, or do they feel like they're marginalised and outside that space. And then finally, non-inclusive practices are felt by young disabled people, and I think that's critical actually. So this is just one of a quote from Jane, a young person that I spoke to about her physical education experiences. And I'll just pause for a moment so you can read that. So for me, what I take from Jane's account there is, you know, where she's talking right at the beginning, I get asked all the time, do I want to sit out? And then right at the end of the account there, what it feels like, it's like the teacher spots problems, the teacher sorts problems out all in one go, no kit, wrong kit, misbehaving and me, can you see, I'm on the problem pile. And actually Jane goes on to say after that, PE is over for me. So it's really quite profound that this young person is very in tune with the sense that they have of the physical education teacher, and the physical education teacher is really a key broker there, and just the manner and the way in which the physical education teacher is talking to Jane, and the expectation and the way Jane's being marked out by that physical education teacher means that this young person is actually not particularly motivated within physical education, and the likelihood is that she's not going to be motivated to want to engage in an active, which could be sports related kind of lifestyle in later life as well. So it's really profound the effect that physical education teachers may have on young people. And I should add there, it's not just young people with disabilities either. We know we're shaped by the teachers that have educated us, and that can be really, really positive, but it can also be more challenging for some people. So the next key messages that I want to highlight here from research is that PE teachers value skilled, competent and able pupils. So that's the kind of the gold standard, the marker that teachers are often looking at within a physical education class. Most importantly though, young disabled people recognise that PE teachers value a certain kind of skilled, competent and able pupil. So PE teachers, pupils understand what PE teachers are actually valuing within physical education. And then added to this, according to young disabled people, PE spaces can hinder and support feelings of belonging. And again, that's key. So let's look at what a young disabled person said that speaks to these three messages here. Again, I'll just give you a moment to read and reflect. Any initial thoughts about James's account of physical education?
He seems well in tune to me. Like he can identify that he has to go with people just to take part, and that it does require additional skill and negotiation. I think that's really in tune with that.
Yeah, so James, I think you're saying James is in tune. James is a really reflective young person, isn't he?
Yeah.
And the point that you've highlighted there as well, actually, around, and where does he say it? I'd say it makes me very skilled at an advanced level, because James is having to work with his walking frame and negotiate whatever activity is going on. Actually, James is quite aware that he's doing some extra thinking that the physical education teacher isn't even engaging with him. And I would agree that James is a very able pupil because he's able to engage in that thought process, but he's also able to put that thought process into practice in terms of actually what he's doing. So I think that's a really important point that you draw out there.
Yeah, it's something we touched on like the last 2 days. It's like very performance driven, right? And usually even measured against those non-disabled standards of performance. And that's completely like captured in here as well, that we don't acknowledge any wins that are different from like that performance driven here, school team's performance.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So towards the end of the quote, James there talks about Mr. Davis, who's the physical education teacher, and how he understands what Mr. Davis values, but James is feeling like he can't live up to those expectations, and it is a very sports-based performative discourse, again, which is very dominant within physical education.
It's quite a lazy way to do things as well, where all you see is the person who's at the front. You know, as you look at the hands, you go for a quick kind of assessment of what's going on. The winner, that's it.
Yeah, so there's a narrow measure there of how we're seeing different students performing, and it is just about the first person that gets to the line first, if you like. And there's no other sense of other social, cognitive, all sorts of different kinds of things that physical education brings to the table as well. The teacher there is focusing on kind of physicality and performance, so that's key.
So that looks when you say like assessment here and what we're actually assessing, because it would just come from the PE teachers, it's that force upon you that they have to improve the level, they have to increase the level, but what are we actually assessing? And even though you don't have to assess in PE anymore, it's still very much that traditional thing, developing those skills performance, but what should we be assessing on things like effort, engagement, and as you mentioned before, confidence being the value? I still think we need loads of confidence, because you can be confident in balance.
Yes, yeah.
But the fact that you're doing it and engaging is a positive.
Yeah. So I think what I'm just trying to do in this session is to get us all to think about the importance of actually engaging and listening to young people about how they're experiencing in this context physical education here. So just to build on that, on each of the tables I've shared with you a story which is called My Basketball Mad Family, and it's Robin, a young person, talking about his wheelchair basketball experience. I think the important thing to note here is what I've actually done is I've crafted that story, but it's based on a series of interviews that I've had with James and his family, and then a series of discussions that I've had with James about the story that I've been crafting. So whilst I'm the writer of it, if you like, I've taken the interviews and the discussions and going to watch and see basketball with James and his family and created this story, and then collectively together we've decided what that story should look like. So this is James's story. So the two questions I've got as you read through this is, what does this story tell you about disability in sport? And does this story help you to think about planning? How does this story help you to think about planning opportunities for young disabled people? So two questions there, and maybe use the flip side of your post-it for this. Are we ready to just give a little bit of feedback then? So rather than going to each table, I'm really happy for people to just offer their feedback at this point. So what does this story tell us about disability in sport?
We finished with the non-practical saying that it's more of a sense of community and how the families would have place on that. So that's just a thought I think in terms of something that's happening with the performance and how to make that the value of the local role as well.
Okay, so the comment there was around community and family, and that sense of belonging, particularly for Robin and his family, and really brought into and embraced wheelchair basketball. I think this table here had quite an interesting point about Dan, didn't you?
Yeah, I thought that the family was in a way a bit supportive and negative, and also that can impact his confidence later on in life in everything that he does, so not encouraging.
Well, the family looks a little selfish, and for Dan, he is not challenged physically, not challenged socially. So yeah, I think it's going to be big family troubles in some years.
So Dan, who is a non-disabled young person, which isn't explicitly outlined in the story there, he was the one having a less favourable experience, really, wasn't he? And I think that's the point, really, that you're trying to make there. So on the one hand, it really is about family and inclusion, but in this particular story, it's Dan that perhaps potentially may feel more at the margins of his experience. And actually, I think what this story quite nicely demonstrates how there's that inversion there. So it's a non-disabled or able-bodied person that's feeling at the margins and not able, which is quite different to what many young disabled people feel within physical education.
Dan is disabled.
Dan is not disabled. Dan is disabled, yes. So
He's not capable of doing what his elder brothers do,
yeah,
or what his brothers do. And so it's actually, role modelling, hero worship,
yeah.
which is quite reversing.
Yeah. So I suppose if we're considering that Dan's disabled in this context, if we're thinking of different models of disability, quite nicely this demonstrates how that particular activity is constructed in a way that's not being inclusive to that young person that's an able-bodied disabled person.
We actually, very similar to that, we will actually have mainstream children come into my setting and participate in our physical education lessons where our children will lead the sessions. And it's exactly that. I think it's something not all schools have reflected, but being brave and equipped in the sense that actually we call it reverse inclusion in our setting, but it's fundamentally what we do where we're giving our young people more power over that.
Yeah. And are there particular activities you do in relation to that?
Yes, it's all blend sports.
Right.
All blend sports. So mainstream site children come into a curriculum called project based in anyway, exactly. Mainstream students, still mainstream schools that come in and work alongside our students.
Yeah. I mean, I think goalball, for example, is, I can't understand why within a mainstream curriculum it's not played more, because it's an activity that most people wouldn't have played. So in that respect, people aren't coming into that context with already developed and refined skills. So it's more equalising in the way that is experienced, and it can be quite. It can make some young people that are usually deemed to be able pupils feel quite vulnerable, actually, So I think within physical education, it's a shame that more disability sports aren't played within physical education, actually. Oh, I thought you were saying you've got a question, then, but you're telling me there's 5 minutes left.
You've got 5 minutes. You can have an extra 5 minutes, because I think we started 5 minutes late. But yeah, I just thought as a similar point. Here we use sitting volleyball for something similar. We do it with our first years in induction week, because we don't know the students, and sometimes we've got, various abilities, and because very few of them have played volleyball at all, and then even less have played sitting volleyball, it's a nice equalising activity. And on the first day of your university experience, we don't have anybody going home feeling that they got rugby tackle if we've done a rugby or something like that. So similar, but yeah, 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Yeah. Any other reflections on the story then?
Because one of the things is the wheelchair can be a tool, and then it's who's using it. But so it's this thing, it's a disability thing. Well, it doesn't have to be. Sitting volleyball is actually you just decide to sit down and play volleyball.
Yeah.
It isn't disability volleyball. But goalball can quite easily be two teams of people sighted.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
and it's not we're trying to figure out what it's like to be blind. You just play a different game.
Yeah. So the challenge of disability sport or parasport is the labels that they have. For some people, that might mean that they're reading those sports in a particular way, which means they're seeing sports that are specifically for disabled people.
Yeah.
So there's you could say actually we need to reframe how what we consider to be disability sports are almost marketed now, so they're not necessarily always seen as disability sports, and then does that give you more traction within the community of sport?
Because they end up being considered as being inferior. Disability, but also inferior, rather than something which is a standing up kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it is that, it's disability, but I think it's the inferior, superior.
Yeah. And I did some research, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, where I was asking non-disabled young people about disability sports within the curriculum, and essentially what we found out is the position that those sports had in comparison to other activities within the curriculum was much lesser, because they didn't engage in those activities as much. Those activities were generally, it might have been like a one-off rather than a term of activity, and then there weren't after-school clubs or opportunities available either. So the perception then was that they weren't valued as much. And again, I think there's lots of work to be done, particularly within teacher education and on sports coaching and physical education courses, to try to revalue what these activities are, so they are seen in a much more equalised way to other kinds of activities that are engaged with within the curriculum. So I just want to go on to a few more messages now. And we know from the research that we've done that PE teachers feel ill-equipped to support disabled pupils, and I think that very much speaks to the findings that you've had from your project, Tabo, in terms of sport coaches more broadly. Having said that, we also know from research that having a positive attitude about including disabled pupils is crucial. So just having that willingness or desire, and then PE teachers, they need to be open-minded, and PE teachers that are open-minded and pupil-centred and willing to share practice is critical to supporting inclusive practice. So whilst we may say more teachers need continuing professional development and training, just like coaches, actually there's a mindset there that's required to be willing to think differently, to think outside the box of physical education that you've experienced already, and to be willing to just have a go and do things a little more differently. And again, this is a reflection from Joel, who was involved in an action research project actually, and he's a primary school teacher, and this is his sort of reflection and the way that he's grappled with thinking about working, or I would say not working with, in his case, a student with a physical disability. So I'll just give you a moment to read that. So I think for me what's key to what Joel says here is he was positioning this particular student in a particular way, and then that reinforced the sense that that student shouldn't or wouldn't engage in physical education. And I think the really pertinent part of Joel's reflection there is right at the end, where he says so the kind of the outlook that he had wouldn't be appropriate in any other learning area, so any other area of the curriculum, but it was happening in physical education. So again, I think, and I understand that primary school teachers, as was mentioned yesterday in one of the sessions I was in, don't necessarily get lots of teacher education around thinking about physical education. So I can understand why primary school teachers may feel ill-equipped. But actually, primary school teachers, from my experience, are usually really pupil-centred. So even without, and I would argue sometimes it's better not to be trained in physical education, because there's a problem with physical education. So to be trained in it means that you might be perpetuating a model that maybe does need to be rethought, whereas primary school teachers are really, they think about the students in front of them and they develop the curricula around those. So I think primary school teachers are well positioned to teach physical education actually, even if they don't have the specific subject knowledge necessarily. But again, I think what's really important with Joel there, he was willing and open, and he was being quite reflective, which again, in Tabot's resource that he's developing, reflection is a really important, well, one of the chapters, and that's really important. So another message is that actually we do need to listen to and we do need to amplify the voices of young disabled people if we want to take transformational change seriously within physical education. And most importantly, from my experiences, young disabled people do want to tell you their stories about their physical education experiences, and that's critical. And this is just an illustrative example of this. So this is some research that I did where young people were drawing and then explaining and talking about the pictures that they drew. So this is Mary here, and Mary's drawing is the one, it's the top right-hand corner, and actually there's Mary on the left and her support assistant on the right. She happens to use a wheelchair, and in the discussions with her, I was saying, oh, it's great, Mary, what have you drawn there? Are they all the cones and things that you're trying to manoeuvre around on the sports hall floor? And she's like, no, Hayley, they're the markings on the sports hall floor. So if you use drawings and research, it's actually really important that you ask people what the drawing's about, because otherwise you will have a different interpretation than they have. But Mary, as you can see, was delighted because I used her drawing with some CPD that I was doing with PE teachers, and she was really proud and pleased that she knew that picture and drawing was being used by PE teachers to get them to reflect upon how they needed to begin to think differently about physical education. So just to kind of sum up, inclusion in PE, I would suggest, is about, and I know I've not mentioned policy today, but I think policy and strategy is important. In a session that I was in earlier today, we did talk about policy. I think the critical thing for me there is there's often slippage between what policy we have or what strategy we have and then what is the reality of what's being delivered within physical education. So because you have policy, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything will change and everything's okay. So I think that's really critical there. We know in terms of environment, the access to space and opportunities is really important. Equally, the nature of the curriculum and how that curriculum's taught, so pedagogy within physical education is important if we want to rethink including people with disabilities within physical education. I think today in this session I've demonstrated how relationships, or the lack of relationship and engagement and interaction with young disabled people, can really frame their views of physical education. And also that feelings of belonging and acceptance are important, and if you can't nurture that within the settings that you're teaching in, then it's more likely that those young people may not feel as engaged and as included within physical education. And then finally, just recognising that the physical education classroom is really different. We never teach the same group of young people. So even if you have 1 or 2 disabled people in your class, the variety of differences that the rest of the class has shouldn't be underestimated, actually. So here I'm thinking, and I know Tanny last night, for example, was talking about being a disabled woman, being a slightly more mature disabled woman. She also talked about issues of class as well. So all of these differences are very important for the disabled people that we might teach or coach, and we shouldn't just always see a disabled person as a disabled person, because for some of those disabled people, different kinds of identity markers will be more important and come to the fore at different times, and that might be the case within physical education. So as this table mentioned earlier, you know, physical education within an English context is a very gendered subject area. So for some girls and boys, gender might be something that's more important if they happen to have a disability as well. So we need to understand the complexities of the young people that we're teaching, actually. So the final thing I will just leave with you to reflect on is, from the messages that I've talked about today, what is the key message that you'll go away and chat to your colleagues about when you return to the settings that you work in? So that's one thing I'd like you to reflect on. The second thing I'd like you to reflect on is, if you notice in the middle of the table, there's a folded up little sheet of paper. I'd invite you to each take one of those. That's actually an account from a young disabled person, again talking about physical education. My challenge to you is to take that again back to your work context and have a conversation with a colleague about what's written there. So thanks very much for your time today. I hope I've enabled you to gather a little bit more of an understanding of what young disabled people are telling us about their physical education experiences. And please do take one of those notes and talk to one of your colleagues about what that young person's telling you. Thanks very much.